Policy Act documents for federally funded projects. She helps NDDOT personnel with any questions they may have throughout the life of a project and passes along pertinent new information from FHWA headquarters. The District FHWA office also assists NDDOT in developing environmental policies that comply with federal laws, policies, guidance, and regulations. Melissa earned a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Southern New Hampshire University and an associate of applied science degree in engineering technology from Bismarck State College, and has 9 years of industry experience. Before joining FHWA, Melissa worked for 2 consulting firms doing survey work, transportation design for state and county projects, and environmental work, writing NEPA documents, field studies, and permitting. And so let's welcome Melissa. Okay, and after Melissa, we're going to have Patty. So, excuse me. I'm just going to pull up their bios on our phones. So, Patty Winn, National Environmental Policy Act Liaison at the NDDOT. Patty is the NDDOT's National Environmental Policy Act Liaison, working with internal technical support and external consultants on various NDDOT projects across the state. Before joining NDDOT, Patty worked at the Department of Environmental Quality, now the North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality, in the water quality and permitting sections. She holds a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Carroll College and served with the U.S. Army for 5 years, working in aviation. She was commissioned and continued her service in the North Dakota National Guard as an engineer officer. She recently retired from that position. Let's welcome Patty. Okay, and last is Jamie Wark. Jamie Wark is the project manager from SRF Consulting Group. Jamie has been with SRF Consulting Group for 9 years and is part of the Transportation Environmental Planning Group. He leads environmental planning efforts throughout North Dakota and northern Minnesota and has authored a variety of NDDOT environmental documents. Prior to joining SRF, Jamie worked in Minnesota for the White Earth Reservation tribal government, where he compiled National Environmental Policy Act documentation, conducted Phase 1 environmental site assessments, and provided compliance assistance for underground storage tank owners and operators. Jamie holds a bachelor's degree in geography from Bemidji State College. Let's welcome Jamie. And thank you guys all for your time and attention today.
Hi. As she outlined, my name is Melissa, and I apologize in advance. My portion of this is rather word heavy and very law and policy heavy, so I might read more than I might look at you guys because I want to recite this properly. Anyway, so as she outlined, I'm the right-of-way and environmental program manager for the North Dakota Division of the Federal Highway Administration. My role is to review the DOT projects and provide clarification and guidance as appropriate for compliance with the federal law. Today I'm going to step you guys through the existing laws, executive orders, MOUs, action plans, and DOT orders that help us address environmental populations. Oops, let's go back. We're going to start off here with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that was signed by President Kennedy, which outlined as below prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial aid. Which brings us to Executive Order 12898, Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations, which was signed in 1994 by President Clinton. This order directs all federal agencies to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human or environmental impacts of projects on minority and low-income population, and establishes an interagency working group on environmental justice. The presidential memorandum that accompanied Executive Order 12898 states, in part, I am therefore today directing that all department and agency heads take appropriate and necessary steps to ensure that the following specific directives are implemented immediately. In accordance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, each federal agency shall ensure that all programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance that affect the human health or the environment do not directly or indirectly, sorry, I lost my spot here, through the contractual or other arrangements use criteria, methods, or practices that discriminate on the basis of color, race, or national origin. As you can see on the graphic on the right here, there's a very small overlap between this executive order and Title VI, which is our minority populations. Okay. Following Executive Order 12898 was the establishment of the signing of the Environmental Justice Memorandum of Understanding, which was signed by the Secretary of Transportation, along with the heads of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Energy, Department of Health and Human Services, the EPA, the USDA, and several other federal agencies, not limited to what I listed here. This was signed in August 2011. The purpose of this MOU is to declare the continued importance of identifying and addressing environmental justice considerations in agency programs, policies, and activities as provided in Executive Order 12898, including as the agency is not already covered by this order. To renew the process under Executive Order 12898 for agencies to provide environmental justice strategies and implementation progress reports, to establish structures and procedures to ensure that the interagency working group operates effectively and efficiently, to identify particular areas of focus to be included in the agency environmental justice efforts. This MOU confirmed the continued importance of identifying and addressing environmental justice in agency programs, policies, and activities. Following this MOU, the U.S. DOT established Order 5610.2A, which was signed in 2012, which updated the U.S. DOT's environmental justice procedures so that each mode of the DOT needed to comply with on other projects. This order outlined what information should be obtained, such as population served and or affected by race, color, or national origin and income level, proposed step to guard against disproportionately high and adverse effects on persons based on their race, color, or national origin and income level. It also outlines the processes which we should enact to avoid discrimination and avoid disproportionately high and adverse effects on minority populations and low-income populations by first identifying the population, proposing measures to avoid, minimize, and or mitigate the impacts of the DOT programs, and provide offsetting benefits and opportunities to enhance communities, neighborhoods, and individuals. Following the U.S. DOT's Order 5610.28, FHWA issued their own order, 6640.23A, which was originally signed in 1998 and updated in 2012. This order strengthened the U.S. DOT's order and established policies that FHWA would follow in their projects and programs. These listed laws, policies, and guidance are what the North Dakota Department of Transportation developed their guidance based off of. The state DOT's guidance is written in the design manual, which is approved by our FHWA office. Looking forward, our new president has issued Executive Order 13985, further advancing racial equity and support for the underserved communities through the federal government, and the U.S. DOT has formed their Equity Action Plan. Further guidance has yet to come on how these orders and action plans will be implemented in federal highway and programs such as our state DOTs. In summary, Title VI and EJ apply to all activities which are undertaken, funded, and approved by the FHWA, FTA, or other U.S. DOT components. And if you guys would like to review any of this information provided here, you can see this on our environmental toolkit on the FHWA site. So if you need to get any of this information, you can find it on FHWA. And that brings it to Patty.
Thanks, Melissa. Here's the clicker. Sorry, thanks. Okay, so I'm Patty Winn. I'm the NEPA practitioner with the North Dakota DOT. So what I'm going to go through is basically everything Melissa presented. We've brought it into a single document, so we can apply it through our process through NEPA documentation and through our categorical exclusions or our EAs or EISs. So I expect all my NEPA practitioners that I see here to be providing us exceptional work after this. So we've kind of simplified our process a bit, and we've created a step-by-step process. So our first step here, we're just going to identify an area. We recommend using the EPA EJ mapping tool. We had a little bit of technical difficulty. I was going to show you the tool and kind of use how it brings it up, but this is kind of what it brings up. It'll provide a map, and so what we require is a quarter-mile buffer area around a linear area of a project. Sorry if I wander away from the mic. So this kind of gives us a snapshot of our area and the area that we'll be impacting. With this, it has a drop-down list, and we can, from there, add a report. And so the tool will automatically produce a report for us that'll give us a percentage number. So with that percentage number, that's where we can kind of identify that population living within that community. So for this example, just in Bismarck, North Dakota, I found a population of about that 40%, and then with that state percent of being 16%. So we have kind of an identified population within that area just in Bismarck. So that's kind of showing us what we have is a meaningful difference of percentages. So it's more than 10% is kind of what we're looking at for these reports. So anytime that we have that more than 10%, we're going to say that there is an identifiable community within that project area. So within our analysis, if we hadn't found that meaningful difference, then we kind of end the report there. We'd say there is not a readily identifiable population within that community, and that's where we'd end our report, but we'd still add that to our categorical exclusion, and we'd document that. Within the categorical exclusion, we're going to bring that up in the body of text as well. So we will still discuss it, but we'll just to say that the population was not identified within that study area. However, if we have identified that population, then we're going to move on to the next step. So now we're into step 3. So this is kind of an all-inclusive, not really all-inclusive list, so it's just kind of an example. It's a lot of words there, but what we want you to take away from that is that more study and research needs to be done within the population. So, you know, what are the minimizations, what are our avoidances, and then, or whatever are our benefits, because often a lot of times within the communities that we're working in, we're actually providing a benefit to any of the population, to include the low-income or minority populations, you know, providing a connectivity or better sidewalks, things like that. However, if we are finding things that might be more impactful in a negative value, then we're obviously going to move on to the next step and go into further analysis into our document. But if we've kind of gotten to a point where we're like, okay, we're providing more of a benefit than a negative impact, then we're going to kind of stop our process there. We've kind of analyzed it, and we can add that into our environmental document from that point. So if we still do have the adverse impacts, though, we are going to move on to that step 4. So now this is where we want to get into the proportionality of our impacts. So are we impacting a population that might be minority or low income? Is it going to be a disproportionate? So our effects are focusing in on that group versus like our general population. So we have to provide some sort of a rationale to kind of describe what we're doing within that area. But again, if we are not disproportionately impacting any population, then it's kind of like an overall impact. So what we can take away from that is it's not a disproportionate impact, but it's still just an impact and something that we would study still through our regular NEPA guidance. And so we would probably stop our documentation at that point and just add that into our CADEX or our EA, whatever type of environmental document we're working with at that point, so we can just making sure that we're providing that rationale. So now we're going into step 5, and this is kind of, if we get into that point of we have that extreme case, and Jamie's going to kind of show us that example of where we have to go in, we have disproportionately impacted a community that's considered a EJ population. Some of the things that we're going to take away from this is we've worked with the community, we've talked with community action groups, the cities, HUD, different people in the community, people within that neighborhood, so we can kind of identify a little bit more key of like how we are impacting that community or that project area more than just we would regular community impacts. So with that, when we get into this point as well, so we've kind of identified that we've gotten into those impacts, but what are the things that we can do to refine, enhance, or adjust our impacts? Can we look at all of our alternatives and go, gosh, maybe we should take this alternative off the table altogether, and then we can kind of go back to that step 1 and kind of refine our process through that? Or are we still going to be moving forward and having these impacts to the population, so we need to provide additional mitigation, you know, whether it's noise analysis or even providing better stormwater plans for the area. Maybe even looking at adding additional options to provide those benefits. So at this point, this is where we kind of end our analysis, but at the same time, we have to go through these considerations throughout the process. So then if we kind of go back into saying we've taken out an alternative or we've refined our alternatives, then we need to kind of go back to that step 1, and we're going to go through our process again. But again, within this documentation, we are going to add it through our NEPA document, and then adding it to our appendix and making sure that we are putting this into the body of text so that it's clear within our document what our intent is, and then what our outcomes and what our impacts are, and how it might be negative or beneficial to our project. The other big thing about this as well is making sure that we maintain those communications or connections within those city communities. That's a really big process for the EJ population impacts. We need to make sure that we are to communicate and document everything that we're doing with this process, because if we kind of lose that step, then we kind of lose the whole process and the whole point of it. So it's really important that we are describing what we're doing and then also documenting what we're doing within that environmental document as well. And from there, do we have any questions?
Patty, do you look at the potential for the cost of the project? Well, we'll back up. The Bismarck area you described, high minority, high low income. Quite often the city of Bismarck does special assessments to the project area, and the ones closer might have to pay a little bit more. Now, if those financial costs to those low-income people might be out of proportion to somebody like me who lives in a more affluent part of town, is that something that you would take into consideration in analyzing your impacts?
So I think that's definitely something that we need to add into analyzing our impacts. And so hopefully that if the North Dakota DOT, or if we have a consultant group doing that, that's a question, and it's something that we're analyzing within our document. When it comes into the decision-making process, though, that's going to be a little bit higher above myself, or even working with that community as well, because some of those come into maybe like even voting rights within the community. So, but it is something that should be discussed within our documentation process. No, so, okay, if we're taking up any kind of temporary or permanent right-of-way, that's where we're going to analyze this. But if we're not going into the right-of-way with this kind of project, so we have like mill grade overlay type stuff where we're not going to be stepping outside of our bounds, we don't need to do this type of level of analysis for our projects. Have anything else? Great, well, thank you very much for listening very attentively.
Good afternoon. I'm Jamie Wark with SRF Consulting Group. I'm an environmental planner with the primary task of authoring environmental documents for clients such as North Dakota DOT. I was on a project team that completed the EJ analysis for the Fargo Main Avenue reconstruction project, and we are going to jump in to that project. So the project itself is the project limits go from 25th Street to University Drive in the city of Fargo. It's 1 mile of urban reconstruction. The full reconstruction goes from business front to business front throughout the corridor. Improvements will take place to the pavement and underground utilities, as well as the pedestrian environment and upgrades to ADA facilities. The environmental document completed for this project was an environmental assessment. Originally, it was scoped as a documented CAD-X, but after discussion between North Dakota DOT and FHWA, due to potential impacts to EJ populations and building and properties and potential relocations, this discussion was had and the environmental document was elevated to an environmental assessment. So the project, the purpose and need of the project is up there to replace the aging infrastructure, improve pedestrian accommodations, close or consolidate access points, as well as support local and regional mobility. So the graphic you're looking at right now is the map, the study area that was created as part of the project. The outline boundary you see in red is the study area itself. It extends just west of 25th Street and goes east that 1 mile distance to just east of University Drive. The solid orange line that you see is the quarter-mile buffer area that Patty had described earlier. That's where we're going to take a look at the census data, the demographic data, and determine what type of percentages of low-income and minority populations are within that area. And the dashed orange line on the outside of that graphic is the half-mile buffer area, where we're going to take a look at additional investigation into facilities, some services that would be provided to EJ populations in the area. So when we took a look at the demographic area within the study area, we came up with a 29% minority population within that study area. The city of Fargo identified their minority population as 19%. So earlier Patty said that we're looking for a 10%, around that 10% difference to determine whether or not there is a minority population. So we're right in that range. So in addition to the minority, we also looked at the low income, and this was a little bit more obvious. There was a 57% low income population within the study area compared to the 30% within the city of Fargo. So that 27% is an obvious low income population within that study area. So in addition to the quarter-mile buffer area, we also took a look and did additional investigation into the half-mile buffer area. And we were able to identify quite a few different properties, services, facilities that serve EJ populations. I think the one number I'd like to point out on this slide itself is 35 businesses that were owned and or serving EJ populations were identified within that half-mile buffer area. So, really what does that mean? In addition to the demographic data, there's also some key EJ indicators within and around that project. So, we made a determination, and that determination was that there are low-income and minority populations within the study area. So, Patty had mentioned this earlier. There is a key component of an EJ analysis is to make sure that you're communicating and coordinating with a variety of different agencies, owners, businesses throughout this process. So we did start out with some sort of outreach in the form of SOV letters. Those are required through the North Dakota DOT's environmental process. Reach out to federal, local, state agencies, advocacy groups in the region to notify them of the project, but also ask for feedback. In addition to the SOV letters, There was a public input meeting. There was a project review committee that included City of Fargo, North Dakota DOT, FHWA, and a consultant team that met regularly to discuss build alternatives, options, impacts, mitigation, minimization. We had 3 business property owner meetings that were not advertised, in which the property and business owners along the corridor were invited to discuss the project itself. And then there was also individual meetings with individual business and property owners that may be impacted along the corridor as well. So coordination throughout the process, the environmental process was key. So throughout the environmental process, you need to identify alternatives to evaluate. And there were 4 alternatives that were carried forward, including the build alternative. So the 3 build alternatives were build alternative C1, which is a 4-lane highway with a 6-foot sidewalk throughout the corridor. Build alternative C2 was a 4-lane roadway with reduced width sidewalks in certain areas with 5-foot sidewalks. And then there was a alternative D, which is a 3-lane alternative. So those were the build alternatives carried forward. There were some that were reviewed, and after coordination amongst the North Dakota DOT, City of Fargo, and FHWA, a couple of them were dropped. There were also multiple build options carried forward. There was one relevant build option that was relevant to the EJ analysis, and that was build option 4, which was a slight roadway shift of the main avenue corridor to reduce building impacts. And I will get into those impacts alternatives right now. So alternative C1, as I mentioned before, was it's a 4-lane with a 6-foot sidewalk throughout the entire corridor. Because I'll point out the graphic on this screen. I'm not sure if you can see it or not, but on this graphic on each side of the roadway, it identifies a 6-foot sidewalk and a 4-foot boulevard. So that's a major improvement over what's out there right now from a pedestrian facility standpoint. So from pedestrian improvements, it's great. But there was also 7 impacts to 7 buildings as a part of that, because the sidewalk width, the width of the sidewalk and boulevard impacted 7 properties. And then 2 of them were modifications, and 5 of them were potential relocations. So Patty had mentioned disproportionate impacts before. That's what we're trying to evaluate and take a look at. In this instance, in this build alternative, there was a disproportionate impact to an EJ population due to the fact that there would be impacts to properties that would require modifications and or relocations. So here's a layout of that corridor. So for all build alternatives, from 25th Street to 18th Street, it remains a 5-lane corridor. From 18th to 17th, it narrows down, kind of transitions down to that 4-lane segment, and then from 17th to University is really where the impacts are we're looking at. So two eastbound lanes, 1 westbound lane, and a center turn lane. So the impacts to C1, I want to show these 2 graphics. I think they're pretty telling. One is a property of 1345 along Main Avenue. It's called International Market Plaza. You can see it in the graphic, in the photo, that the sidewalk, actually the building, the edge of the building is very close to the edge of the curb of the roadway. In some instances, it's 3 feet down to maybe 1 foot clearance. As you can see, there's a bollard in that picture. So pedestrians who use that corridor, a very limited space, you feel very unsafe in that. So there is a reason to obviously widen the sidewalks to that 6 foot, preferably to account for FHWA's complete streets design. But if you're going to widen them, you're also going to impact that building. So I wanted to show you how close that location is to the roadway. And in addition to the actual building, this is a very unique situation. Within the International Market Plaza at 1345, there are 18 individual businesses that are housed there. And there are small businesses, and they are EJ populations. So if you look at the picture on the right, you'll actually see 4 businesses there based upon their doors that slide open. And they're not only owned by EJ populations, they provide services to EJ populations in the area as well. So I just want to point that out to you. So build alternative C2 is again a 4-lane segment of roadway from 17th Street to University Drive. But in this alternative, there are 6-foot wide sidewalks, 4-foot wide boulevards throughout the corridor until you get to an area where it would potentially impact a building. And in that scenario, in that instance, the sidewalks and the boulevards were narrowed to avoid impacting those properties and potentially impacting the EJ populations. So this is very close to the same alternative as C1, but C2 narrows sidewalks and boulevards to minimize impacts to buildings, or actually eliminate the impacts to the buildings. Here's a layout of that, stick drawing of that same alternative. It's identical to C1. We don't really distinguish between the sidewalk widths in this one, so it's the same graphic as C1. And then the third build alternative was build alternative D, which is the 3-lane. So we obviously remove a lane, a roadway lane, which enables there to be the minimum 6-foot sidewalk, 4-foot boulevard throughout, and avoid any building impact. So here's a stick drawing of that schematic as well. You can see there's a drop lane at 18, transitions down to 3 lanes between 17th and 18th, 1 eastbound lane, 1 westbound lane, and a center turn lane from 17th to University. So one more build option description here is build option 4 that I mentioned earlier. This is a slight shift of the roadway to avoid building impacts at 1345 International Market Plaza, where there are 18 businesses within that building. But it still impacts 6 other properties in the form of 2 with modifications and 3 with the potential for the relocation. So even though it does improve the impacts, there still are impacts there as a result of build option 4. So this table is really an example of how we determine whether or not there's disproportionate impacts throughout the project. You can see the no build alternative. Obviously there are no impacts, but it also does not address the purpose and need of the project. Build alternative C1, we did identify disproportionate impacts due to the impacts to the buildings and impacts to the businesses. So an adverse or disproportionate impact as a result of C1. Alternative C2, no disproportionate, excuse me, I'll go take a step back. C1 with option 4 included. Okay, take a look at that option. They were linked together. There is no disproportionate impacts. Impacts to a different property, 1328, would not be considered disproportionate to EJ populations. And Patty had mentioned earlier before that if you have it could be a negative impact to a property or to a business or to some sort of negative impact, but as long as it's not just an EJ population impact, it could be an EJ and non-EJ population impact, then it's not considered a disproportionate impact in itself. So I just want to make that clear. And then alternative C2 and alternative D, no disproportionate impacts. So that took us through the North Dakota DOT's 5-step process for an EJ analysis. Now what? As Patty mentioned, we have to document everything. So we complete a template provided by the North Dakota DOT for EJ analysis. We attach that to the environmental document as an appendix item. We then add a segment into the environmental document with our summary and findings of the EJ analysis and any disproportionate impacts. And then what we do is we allow the decision makers, in this case, City of Fargo, North Dakota DOT, and FHWA, to take into account EJ analysis, but also the other environmental impacts throughout the project. So it's not just EJ that they're looking at. Even though EJ is a key component of this environmental review, there are other environmental sections that need to be reviewed in total before making a decision on a preferred alternative which to move forward. And so that said, when the EJ analysis was completed and the environmental document was completed and presented to North Dakota DOT, the preferred alternative of C2 with the 4-lane and then the reduction of the sidewalks at the buildings was the preferred alternative for this project. And with that said, I'll stop there and ask if there's any questions. John.
17th, where the westbound went from 1 lane, was there, I'm not familiar with the plot, was that a busy north-south that you would pick up more traffic going to the west and as opposed to the east?
To me, it's the transition where there's a traffic signal there. And I believe that was the mindset behind keeping that signal there. It's a long stretch between signals, so it allows an area for pedestrians to cross. But it seemed like the kind of the natural point for it to transition. It is farther west you get, it gets a little bit less, I don't want to say pedestrian friendly, but the type of businesses that are there are a little bit more industrial. As you get farther east towards downtown, that starts transitioning into more pedestrian friendly businesses. Yes?
Was this signed for public reviews by February before, or has it been signed for?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's already been, the PA was signed by FHWA back in October, the end of October. It was released for public notice November 1st. We had our public hearing in November, and the FONSI was signed in January.
So this was after Executive Order 14096. Did that executive order, which has a lot of different directives, change anything about how we...
Sit down, we can use the mic.
Sure.
The North Dakota division of, yeah. Can you hear me now? The North Dakota division of FHWA still operates under 12898. The U.S. DOT order 5610, and then the FHWA order. There has not been additional guidance provided by the U.S. DOT or FHWA for us to pass down to the states for additional EJ guidance, which is, in my discussion with other divisions across the Mid-America, is pretty typical right now. We just don't have the guidance to push it further.
Anybody else have a question? I wanted to ask, how did you guys decide what a disproportionate impact is, or what number?
So the disproportionate number within, not necessarily just this case study, but we're going to talk about that meaningful percentage. So initially we'll find that identifiable population first, but in this case, like with what Jamie was talking about, was the disproportionality comes into the, like with that building with the international market, that's a direct impact to that population with those building owners and both the population that building is serving.
Can you hear me? Mm-hmm. So one of the main components of looking at the EJ analysis is trying to determine if there is a negative impact to the community cohesion, and the area along that corridor serves an EJ population. So when we look at the disproportionate impact to certain properties that are EJ populations, thinking about removing that building and relocating it would affect that community cohesion that currently resides throughout that corridor.
I was curious, how do you compare your EJ population to, I think one example, you compared it to North Dakota, but the other example is to Fargo. How do you know what to compare it to?
So that's going to depend on the tool you're using. So in my example, I use the EJ screener from the EPA. It's changed probably since we even started the Fargo project. It kind of seems like they've been updating their website probably every couple months. It's, EJ's kind of, I don't want to say it's a new process, but since the current administration, the processes have been updated. And so the EPA has been really scrutinized on this, and they've brought it to our level as well. So the tool that we use started out with counties and city populations, but now it's moved on to state populations. But there are other tools out there. So with our process that we use, we recommend the EPA tool, but there's other tools that we'll accept as well. So if you have that comparative number for the city, that's perfect. But just for what we use right now, the report that we get, it says state.
And just a little bit more background, we did start this process, as I stated, as part of a documented CADX. We did pause that for, Matt, was it a couple months, 2 or 3 months? So there was some more time in there that took longer than it normally would. And as Patty said, there are changes, ongoing. But since we started looking at it through the city's point of view, we stayed with it for that type of evaluation.
Any other questions? Did you guys want to add anything else about the project that you thought was important for them to know? How much does a environmental assessment usually, like what is the cost and the timeline?
Timeline, when you complete an environmental assessment, Federal Highway gives you, I believe, 1 year to complete the process. Considering it's a pretty big document, very thorough, you have to be very efficient with your time and really make sure that you're meeting those deadlines. But as far as, what was your other question? The cost?
Yeah.
I don't know how to answer that.
Okay. Would you like anyone to do anything different, Patty, when it comes to EJ analysis regarding CADXs?
I think the biggest takeaway from this is that the process is working. So we kind of showed an extreme example of what's happened in North Dakota. I think oftentimes we look at North Dakota as that we have populations, either we have populations within our small communities or we have populations on a reservation. And that's kind of how we've divided things, it seems like, within a lot of our projects. However, I think this has shown that we do have populations within our communities that are either low income or also minority populations that we have to take into account. And so I think that our example that we had with Fargo really showed the success of our process. The other portion of it is that that the North Dakota DOT process is something that we should be working with our communities, and we should be working with our consultants on developing this and refining it as well, because our way might not be the 100% way, and it's not the be-all, end-all. So if we're working and communicating with each other and with our community or even our populations that might be impacted, then I think that helps our process overall.
And to add to Fargo a little bit, as they did point out, it was a categorical exclusion to begin with. Federal Highway also began to scrutinize environmental justice at a little bit higher level beginning in about February of 2022. So it was getting looked at probably a little bit more of a depth, because of the international market, and we do track in our system any displacements of a project, and we track the displacements of EJ populations. So that's something, once we get notice that the state or a local agency or anybody who is completing an EA, once we get that notice of intent to do that environmental document, we start tracking that timeline. We are keeping track of any potential displacements, any potential impacts to EJ throughout that project.
I just want to add, in this instance with Fargo Main Avenue, we had another resource that we used as well. It was the Fargo-Moorhead Metropolitan Council of Governments, and MetroCog. They do track a lot of their EJ populations and a lot of that information, demographic information as well. So we really use them as a resource to verify some of the numbers that we had taken a look at. Now that's not probably going to be the case in a lot of the other parts of the state. I'm working on another project right now where we're reaching out to city officials and trying to make sure that if they're, the least you can do is reach out and see if they are in agreement with some of those numbers. You know, the local knowledge sometimes outweighs those demographic numbers, and it's a good way to just check in and see that the local agency, the local community, you have buy-in from them as well.
Yes, go ahead.
Environmental justice sounds like a newer word in the last like 5 years, 10 years, whatever. What was it referred to? I mean, we've been doing this for a while. What was it referred to 20 years ago?
It was environmental justice then too. It's just we're reflecting on it more now with the politics the way it has been the last few years. It's just something we scrutinize a little bit heavier. But as I kind of outlined in the beginning, the original EJ guidance, the executive order was signed back in 1994. So it's been ongoing for a long time.
And then for the DOT, we updated our guidance approximately a year ago, maybe a little bit more. We always had it part of our NEPA process, but it was more part of our checklist and just kind of that community cohesion part of our checklist as well. But with each administration, they kind of bring something into either NEPA or into the environmental eyesight, I guess. And so for the current administration, EJ is a really strong forefront for them.
Yes, go ahead.
Have you seen any examples of like creative mitigation or offset measures besides like, you know, obviously if you had to take down that building, maybe you build a new one and relocate people to a new place. Is there anything aside from like kind of a one-to-one, you have a new space to be in? Is there any creative solutions you've seen to impact communities?
Can you repeat that?
She asked if there were any other mitigation impacts, so besides relocation.
Yeah, actually we had a project pretty close to Four Bears Casino and across the Four Bears Bridge, and so what we analyzed, and this was before we even had our new analysis that we're doing, but we realized that there's low income population that lives across from the casino, but they use that bridge as a walking measure to get across to go either into town, or even like a lot of the kids, they do cross country across the bridge as well. So what we had arranged was busing, or I think we even had a shuttle van to get people across the bridge while we did construction, because we realized that the bridge would be shut down and so low income populations wouldn't be able to traverse. So we mitigated by adding that shuttle service.
And I have a little bit of an example. This isn't North Dakota specific, but it's a topic I discussed with my engineering and operations team lead. In Denver, Colorado, there's a bridge that they built over the interstate. When they put that interstate through there, they separated EJ communities. So they installed that bridge, and it is now, you know, they put a park and stuff up there, so they connected those communities back. So there are, it might not be here in North Dakota right now, but it's out there, and if you want to look for it, you can find it.
Where would someone look for those measures? Just other departments, or?
The FHWA Environmental Toolkit has a lot, their website has a lot of stuff kind of like that. You have to dig a little bit, but it's usually, the FHWA site is pretty good.
Great, thank you guys for joining us today. If you want to give our speakers a round of applause.